Good afternoon, subscribers. Back once again, as promised, to run through some of the questions on the macroeconomics paper. Now, as I said to you before, I've downloaded this summary from OCR Interchange, and it's quite clear to see where candidates found challenges on the macroeconomics multiple choice questions. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, let's get stuck into questions 2, 8, 9, 11, 12 and 15. Okay, so here we have it, the AS Macro, question 2. Let's have a look. What could explain the trade-off between the policy objectives of growth and the balance of payments? So, you'll all be familiar with this term trade-off, particularly, and probably more commonly, with regards to the Phillips curve. So, here's your long-run aggregate supply curve, here's your Phillips curve section here, this being price level, level of real output, and of course the trade-off is that as you increase the level of real output and reduce unemployment, the trade-off is that you accept higher inflation as a consequence. But that's not what this question is asking. This question is asking for some analysis of a different type of trade-off. And of course, one of those comes with the relationship between imports and growth of real output. And I like to illustrate this by way of a withdrawals injections diagram. So we've got imports here on the y-axis, the level of real output on the x, and imports, as you know, are induced variables. In other words, as the level of real income increases, people find that they have more money to spend, and consequently the demand for luxury goods, particularly from abroad, increases. And so the trade-off is that as the economy grows and we move in this direction, the economy sucks in a greater level of imports, thus creating a trade balance problem. Maybe that problem goes so far as to move into trade deficit. So let's have a look at the potential answers. Economic growth caused by technical progress reduces the price of exports. Now, of course, in that instance, there is no trade-off because you've got growth and you're benefiting from reduced price of exports. If high earners see their income rise more than low earners, then the benefits of growth will not be shared equally. Well, that is factually correct, isn't it? However, government intervention would be intervening in order to ameliorate that situation. But then the other thing is that we're talking about growth here, but we're not really identifying one of the other big macroeconomic objectives, such as inflation or unemployment. So I would be setting that one aside. Rising output increases the amount of goods and services available to export. So we've got growth and more goods. No trade-off. When income rises, the demand for imports increases. Absolutely correct. Creating the trade balance problem. Hence the answer to this particular question is D. Okay. 8. Let's have a look at 8. Right, okay. So I think this caused a lot of problems, primarily because of the whole, I think, notion and understanding of this term fixed and the way it's used in the OCR textbook. So students in the past, when they've been considering, for example, fixed exchange rates, will have looked, for example, at the gold standard, whereby currencies were locked in at a specific price and value of gold, and truly fixed in that sense. But certainly most of the textbook analysis that is, certainly in the OCR textbooks, refers to either some notion of a fixed range with an upper ceiling and a lower floor, which then permits some type of government intervention, because the currency can float within boundaries, but then if necessary, the government can intervene in order to manipulate that value. So the diagram that you're thinking of, or you ought to be thinking of, that one, would of course be the diagram for this so-called hybrid exchange rate type scenario, where you've got your upper ceiling, you've got your lower floor, market forces can determine the exchange rate on a day-to-day basis. This board pen is hopeless. So we've got upper ceiling, lower floor, demand for the currency, supply of the currency. And what can happen is that on a day-to-day basis, the currency can float, and it may be the case that it floats within these boundaries, in which case no action is required. However, should, for example, the supply all of a sudden shift here to S2, which is clearly beneath the lower floor, that requires government intervention. And so that's the hybrid situation. And that's really what is being described here, about the Chilean government intervening, and consequently the answer here is 8C for that one. Okay, 9. Now, 9, tricky little question, this one. This requires you to have just a reasonable working knowledge of index numbers. So I'll just give you a sort of a brief little resume on index numbers before we get into this one. So you'll know that index numbers always have a year one, let's say, base, and the base value is always equal to 100. So if in year 2 the value of the index is 120, then we can say that prices, or whatever it is, have gone up by 20%. And if in year 3, let's see if this actually works, 150, we could say that prices have gone up by 50%. But what we couldn't say is that prices have gone from year 2 to year 3 up by 30%, because the change from 120 to 150 is not 30%. You would actually have to you'd have to calculate that. So you'd have to do 150 minus 120, which is 30, over 120, so that would actually give you 25%. And that's really what this question is asking you to do. So it's asking you to, for 2017, so it's obviously from 16, the year on year. So you would do 106.4 minus 103.1 divided by 103.1, which is where you're coming up from, times 100. And that gives you 3.2%. So it's just a question of knowing really how to use those index numbers for that one. Okay, question 11. Right, now. Really interesting question, this one. Very tricky little question, tricky little blighter, this one. And this was to do with your knowledge of the Marshall-Lerner condition. When will an appreciation of a currency result in the current account of the balance of payments improving? Really tricky little question, that one. So let's just look at that. So first things first, you need to know, obviously, about Marshall-Lerner. So what did Marshall-Lerner say? Marshall-Lerner says, if the price elasticity of demand for exports and imports is greater than 1, then a depreciation of the currency will lead to an improvement in a country's trade balance. So, D, by D I mean depreciation. If that happens, then the price of exports will fall, and if they're very responsive to change in price, So if the demand for exports is very responsive to change in price, what you'll find is, according to Marshall-Lerner, is that the trade balance will improve. So you'll be familiar with this whole notion of the J curve. So here we're in surplus, here we're in deficit. You've got a deficit problem. What's the solution? Depreciate your currency and the J curve takes effect. In other words, after an initial deterioration of the balance, it will actually improve and move to surplus. Only if, though, this remains true. Now, the other way of looking at that is, well, if you're travelling along, ladies and gentlemen, in a surplus, and maybe it's too big, you want to bring it down, well, one way to do that is to appreciate the currency. And so you get this inverse J curve effect. So the surplus gets bigger before it starts to reduce over time. Now both of those scenarios are only true if the Marshall-Lerner condition holds, i.e. that the elasticity of demand for X and M is greater than 1. But read the question carefully, and what does it say? When will an appreciation of the currency result in the current account improving? Now we are saying here in our little scenario that if you appreciate the currency, it will ultimately start to deteriorate. Now, when will it not deteriorate if this did not hold? In other words, if the price elasticity of demand for exports and imports was not greater than 1, i.e. was less than 1. And so let's look at the options, and the only scenario where that is the case is option A, minus 0.4 and minus 0.3. The rest is either 1 or equal to 1. Hence, A is the answer. Okay, number 12. Interesting little question. It's particularly relevant, I think, at the moment with our ultra-low interest rates, certainly in the UK, starting to creep up in America, as you know. Macroequilibrium, interest rate 0.1%, in other words, it's almost on the floor. So you've no more room to manoeuvre really with monetary policy. So how would you get the economy moving in this direction? It's very straightforward really. You use expansionary fiscal policy. And then lastly, on the macro, question 15, the poll tax, so the community charge. A flat rate on every adult, a single flat rate. Now, if it's a flat rate on every adult, then that, of course, is a regressive tax. In the same way, you know, sometimes you can think of VAT. Yes, it's proportional, but it's, you know, VAT is also regressive, isn't it? Because it takes a larger proportion of income from less well-off individuals, and the same thing happening here with regard to the poll tax. I remember it well back in the late 80s, early 90s. Okay, ladies and gents, that's it. That is the micro papers for June 2018 AS level. I hope you found that interesting. I think it's a very useful thing to do, and certainly being able to just look at and to view where students have gone wrong en masse is very useful for teaching. It's useful for students, but it's also useful for teachers as well. So I commend it to you. Bye for now.